Hi guys, and welcome to TechFurb. Today we are taking a look at a CPU, the Intel Core i7 2600.
Absolutely. I know it's going to...
For today's video, we are taking a look at this quite old processor from 2011. It is based on the Sandy Bridge architecture, clocks in at 3.4 gigahertz, I believe, and it's not a bad CPU, it does the job, but the question is, has it aged well enough to still be a viable gaming CPU in 2020? So that is what we're going to evaluate today, and to evaluate the, I guess, relative performance of it, we need to compare it against something. We're going to compare it against two other CPUs. The first one is a bit of a curious one. It is the Intel Core i5 4440. I did review that in a previous video, which I will chuck up here somewhere. And that CPU did perform well. It did have one glaring problem, and that was a lack of threads. So in thread-dependent titles, so things like your Ubisoft games, it really did struggle. It had its moments where it stuttered and hitched, and it did want for more threads. Now, the reason why I picked this CPU to compare to the i7 2600 is the 4440 is a bit more of a modern processor. It's on a 22 nanometer node, and it is, well, it should be in theory about 15 to 20% faster single core. So what I want to know is, can the 2600 sort of exceed the performance of that i5 given its extra threads? So that'll be a curious comparison point. And the other processor we're comparing it to is the Ryzen 5 1600, not the AF version, the original Ryzen 5 1600. And the reason we do that is quite simple. The 1600 is my benchmarking CPU. The reason why I do use it is because it's the best available CPU I have for benchmarking. I know there are better processors on the market now, but it is what I have access to. So that's sort of going to represent our modern CPU and what we're hoping to be able to achieve with these older processors, but I don't think it quite will. Now, in terms of the GPUs we're pairing it with, we go with two GPUs, so we will pair it with a GTX 1080 and a AMD RX 480. If you want to compare those to current generation graphics cards, because they are a bit older now, the 1080 compares quite well against a RTX 2070. It's about the same performance level, and for your RX 480, it is comparable to a 1650 Super. So we're looking at basically entry level-ish against really high-end cards. So it gives us a nice spread. And the reason why we do include two graphics cards is, a 1080 will give you a performance ceiling of an old processor like this. But what it doesn't tell you is, well, if you're buying these processors, you're not pairing it with a high-end graphics card, you're pairing it with a low-end graphics card, and you really want to know, is it going to get the most out of that low-end graphics card? So that's why we include the RX 480. So I think with that explanation done, we should jump into some benchmarks. First cab off the rank is CSGO. CSGO is a CPU-dependent title, and as you can see here, when paired with the RX 480, pretty much all three CPUs kind of hitting their limits. So even with the Ryzen 5, when we go to the GTX 1080, we see a slight bump, so it tells us that it is not quite bottlenecking the 480, and the 480 is bottlenecking the 1600. But we do see that, yeah, these CPUs are not able to actually max out an RX 480. Having said that, let's be honest, you're getting 150 plus frames per second, so you're not going to be disappointed in that. Having a look at Dirt Rally 2.0, this is a benchmark that I do like very much because it is very optimized. So we can see here with the RX 480, all three CPUs max out that RX 480. None of them are bottlenecked by the graphics. None of them are bottlenecking the graphics card. It is actually vice versa, and we have to go to a GTX 1080 to find a appreciable difference. And you know what? It's the i7 2600 that comes out the loser. So it's just not quite on the performance level of the 4440, and it's actually not making up a difference in the 1% lows either. So it's very curious to see that difference. Okay, next is F1 2015, and again, we see the i7 2600 at the bottom of the charts, and also the 1080 does seem to boost the average frame rate, but again, we're seeing sort of the RX 480 is about the ceiling of what these CPUs can handle. Next is GTA 5. Now, this is an older title, so I'd expect it to be in preference of the lower core count CPUs, given that that's how game engines worked back then. And surprisingly, the i7 2600 is about equal with the 4440. So it's very curious to see that it can take advantage of the hyperthreading, which is very interesting. RX 480, kind of the bottleneck for those two CPUs. They can't push past the performance of the RX 480 they get. So it kind of tells me again we're bottlenecked, but it is interesting data. Next is PUBG, and very interesting. This is a result that goes to the i7 2600. It does edge out the 4440 with the RX 80, but then with the 1080, it flips back the other way. Okay, next is Apex Legends, and this is a title that scales well, and surprisingly, the 2600 was the superior CPU. Again, it is an online title, and given the way that the 480 to the 1080 scales, I would say that this is actually a GPU limited game. Next is Battlefield 5. Battlefield 5 is a title that is known for wanting for more cores and more threads, and we can see it slightly edging out the 4440. So that's a bit of a recurring theme here. I'm seeing that the 2600, when it can utilize all 8 threads to its full potential, it can slightly outpace the 4440. So it's very interesting to see that data point. Alright, now we're into the Ubisoft titles, and this is where it gets a bit tough for these CPUs. How the benchmark works for Assassin's Creed Odyssey is there's a part in the benchmark where the GPU can actually go absolutely berserk. So what will happen is it'll actually drag up the average performance. So you'll see it might look like there's a bit of scaling between the CPUs going from one graphics card to the next, but that is purely because the graphics card is sort of dragging up that average. So just bear that in mind, and we see that it sort of seesaws back and forward again. So performance about the same from both the older i5 and i7 chips. Next is Far Cry New Dawn, and I was actually surprised by this result because the 4440 outclassed the 2600. Far Cry New Dawn is a modern title running that's from Ubisoft. I have found Ubisoft titles like cores and threads, but that appears to not be the case here. It appears that it is not using all 8 threads, or potentially it just doesn't like the Sandy Bridge architecture. There may be some more optimizations for Haswell in there, but this is a title that does prefer the i5. Okay, next up is Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and again it goes back and forward, and we're seeing similar performance. Breakpoint, I would say, does actually use those cores and threads more effectively, and yeah, the games are running. So we haven't really found a game that won't run so far, so it's good to see that the CPUs can run these modern titles. And remember, we're not running these on super low settings where the CPUs might have a setting missing that will trip them up. These are all on medium to high details. Mostly high details is what I try to aim at, because that's sort of what I game at. And when I do benchmarks, I want to sort of make it as real world as I can. What I would do in the real world, which is crank the graphics slider as high as I can get it to go, to an extent. I don't game at ultra because obviously you lose a lot of performance for not much graphical fidelity. High is that sweet spot, so I try to benchmark in high settings. Next is Fortnite. This is a title that I don't know very well, but it is curious to see that the i7 cleanly, marginally beats out the i5. So again, that performance swings back in the favour of the i7 because it's using all the threads. And we're also seeing some scaling between the 480 and the 1080. So that's good to see, but we're not maxing out the performance of the 480. So just keep that in mind. Fallout 76, we're going to breeze straight over that. Yes, the CPU runs it, and it is capped at 60 frames per second, so we have no idea how well it is running it, but it is running it, so that's that game. Last up is the Outer Worlds. Outer Worlds looks to be a title that prefers GPU over CPU, so here we see, the i5, i7 run it quite comfortably. They're making the most of their RX 480. And when paired with the 1080, we start to see a slight difference in performance. But for the most part, they performed pretty well. This is where it gets interesting. We're now going into the synthetic benchmarks. The reason why that's interesting is because with synthetic benchmarks, they do utilize the cores and threads more. So it'll give us a perspective on how these CPUs are performing when they've got the ability to max themselves out. So 3D Mark Time Spy, we see the i7 slightly edges out the i5. And it's very important to note that, because through all of the gaming benchmarks, what we found is when the cores and threads are utilized, the i7 can match the performance of the i5. But there's no benchmark where the i7 has just cleanly outpaced that i5. It has struggled to either A, keep up with it, or B, just match it. So there is a bit of an argument going the way of the i5, but we'll get into that in the conclusion. Next is Cinebench, and again, we see that slight edge to the i7. Single core, flicks back the other way. We're now in pure Sandy Bridge versus Haswell architecture, and we see the Haswell architecture does have an advantage. That advantage is around 15%, so not a massive gain, but it's enough that when you combine all 4 cores of the i5 and put it against the 4 physical cores of the i7, that's 60% more performance in theory. Next we have the BMW Blender. This is again a CPU render. Higher is worse, so you want the result as low as possible. That's why you're seeing the Ryzen 5 at a very low score. It's because it's time in seconds to complete the benchmark. i7 again, slide edge out. Handbrake, same thing again, lower is better. i7 has the i5. And well, that's it for benchmarks. So I think we should roll into the conclusion. So, final thoughts on the i7 2600. It is still a good CPU in 2020. All things considered, it's still capable of 1080p gaming around 60 FPS if the graphics card can support it. I wouldn't be pairing it with anything higher than a 1650 Super, to be honest, or a 580, 480, 1060. So around that class of GPU, that's about the maximum I'd pair it with. But if you pair it with that, and you're willing to game at medium to high settings, you are going to have an absolutely fantastic time. It is a great CPU. It is still very competent as a gaming CPU, 9 years after its release, I might add. But let's talk a little bit about that comparison against the i5, because it tells another story. If I had to purchase a second-hand system, let's say that I'm not using the i7 2600, I'm someone who's on a really, really tight budget and I need to get something off the second-hand market because I can't afford to buy it new. These CPUs are around the price sweet spot, especially in my area. I'm in Brisbane, Australia, so in my area, these CPUs are around the affordable part. You know, you can pick up a combo of those. You're talking CPU, motherboard, RAM. Maybe some other things. You'd be paying at most $150. If you're paying more than that, you're getting ripped off. And if I had to choose between the two, I would actually go with the i5. The reason why is because the i5, while it's slightly behind the i7 when the i7 can max out its performance, the i7 can't max out its performance all the time. We see that the hyper-threading is not offering a big enough advantage to make up the performance deficit, so I would go with the i5 if I had to choose between the two. In terms of how it compares to a modern processor, that gap was getting quite large to the Ryzen 5 1600. And the reason why I say that that's a bit concerning is because the Ryzen 5 1600 is actually one of the worst performing CPUs that you could buy these days for gaming. It's good for production workloads. It's not a bad CPU in that context. But if you are using it for gaming, whew, man, yeah, rough. There are much better options, given that Zen 2 is now available. We've also had the Intel 10th gen chips just launch. And just, yeah, CPU performance is at a high point that it has not been at in, well, it's been a decade since we've seen something as competitive as this in the market right now. So it's a good time to be a CPU fan. But I think that's going to wrap it up. Thanks for watching, guys. Leave a like if you liked it. Dislike it, sure, you can do that if you didn't like it. Leave a comment down below if you've got any comments or questions on the review. There is the Discord server as well in the link in the video description. You can go follow that link, join the Discord server, and ask me questions on there. I would recommend that over asking questions on YouTube, because I get a fair amount of YouTube comments these days and I just don't have the time to answer them all. So if you put it on Discord, I will answer it, because I don't get a lot of messages on Discord. So preferred way to message me if you're trying to get in contact with me. And lastly, please get subscribed if you're not subscribed. I try to regularly upload content, usually once every 1 to 2 weeks. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.